Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here this evening. We're delighted to have a full auditorium tonight. I'm Dr. James Paharic, the director of the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education here at Seton Hill. And tonight I'm representing our Eva Fleischner Truth Finding program. And so we have a really interesting program for you. We're delighted to have our main speaker, Dr. Yehezkel Landau, with us. We'll also be hearing from Bishop Kulick, who's going to be joining us for some commentary. And also Dr. Sarah Marsh is here. She's the co-chair of the Truth Finding Committee. So we're happy to have you all here tonight. We have an interesting, I think, and hopefully enlightening evening planned for you. But let's begin, as we always do, with a prayer. So I'll ask Monsignor Roger Statnick, University Chaplain, to lead us in prayer.
Let us pray. Holy God, your blessing brings peace on whoever seeks it with a sincere heart. Bring that peace to the peoples who suffer its abuse in the Middle East, the Ukraine, and the Sudan. Make all our hearts sincere in seeking your blessings and honest in our dealings with each other, so that our prayer may bear fruit in the ways nations live with each other. Visit us with shalom through hearts that are true, societies that are just, and a world that reflects your beauty. Holy God, make your dwelling among us so that we can know how to live with each other as you intended. Hear us, your wounded and lost children, for you are our source of life and our final hope for peace, now and forever.
Thank you, Monsignor Statnick. So I want to begin by telling you a little bit about how this evening's program fits into the Eva Fleischner Truth Finding Project. We're so excited to have this opportunity at Seton Hill to teach our students about the rigor and the tenacity, really, that are required to make your way through all the misinformation out there these days and to find your way to truth. So a little bit about Dr. Fleischner. She was a longtime friend of Seton Hill, a member of our advisory board. Her family escaped from Austria in 1938, made their way to the United States. She was a groundbreaking scholar about the Holocaust and also Jewish-Christian relations, and a friend of Seton Hill, a very close friend of Seton Hill for many years. And we are pleased to have Eva's nephew, Christopher, and his wife, Dawn, with us this evening. So thank you both for being here tonight. And thank you for the support of this program and giving us the ability to continue the legacy of Dr. Fleischner. So one of the lessons we took from Eva is that it's important to confront issues honestly, even if they're difficult and in some ways painful. And Eva was part of that generation after World War II that was trying to understand the causes of the Holocaust. And rather than avoiding some of the more unpleasant questions, she dove right into it and was determined to get to the truth, to tell the truth about what happened. And as she wrote, her goal was always to encourage an acceptance of responsibility in Catholics rather than a sense of guilt. So writing from a Catholic perspective, she wrote about Catholic complicity in the Holocaust and did it in an unflinching way. But the goal was to tell the truth, and the idea was that, as she wrote, not to point the finger, but to encourage repentance in our own faith community. And that's a lesson we can all learn in this time, not to shy away from difficult questions, even when they're uncomfortable for us and when they point to our own mistakes, but to honestly confront them, to tell the truth, to admit what happened, to tell the full story. And then we can move on. Then we can heal from whatever trauma has occurred. So Eva was an inspiration to all of us in that way, and we especially need that inspiration today because we live in a time of so much disinformation. We all worry about our students and the misleading information they're exposed to on a daily basis, a kind of avalanche of information, really. And it makes it especially difficult to understand accurately the contentious issues of racism, immigration, and war. And yet, it's our ethical responsibility to investigate those facts and to find our way towards the truth. So we live in a time of dangerous blurring between news and information, journalism and social media posts that we're scrolling through all day long, it seems. And it's important that we get beyond that superficial understanding of what's going in the world to the deeper reality. So tonight we're going to be talking about one of the most difficult issues that face us today, one of the most perplexing issues, and that's the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. We need to be open to the hurt voices on both sides, listen to the narratives, multiple narratives of those involved, rather than making a snap judgment or being misled by the simplistic ideas that we often get from the media, pointing blame at one side or the other. So doing that kind of work, it's not easy. It's not easy for any of us, for us adults. It's certainly not easy for our students. So for that reason, we work with our students on information fluency, media literacy, help them to identify more reliable sources of information, and also support the learning of critical thinking and applying critical thinking skills to what they're uncovering in their search for the truth. And as Dr. Fleischner reminded us, it's more than just getting the facts of the situation, it's applying one's moral intelligence to interpret those facts. That requires honesty and integrity and humility, as well as the tenacity to work through these confusing issues to try to find out a deeper truth about the world. And so being guided by our core values is really essential as we think about these issues. We need to go back to our core beliefs in the sanctity of human life, inherent equality of all, and acceptance of diversity, and embracing universal human rights. These are the things that Dr. Fleischner talked about, and that we as a Catholic institution who base our work on Catholic social teaching rely upon as well. So drawing on those moral principles is truly essential. So tonight we have a very well-known and accomplished speaker to lead us off, Dr. Yehezkel Landau, who has been doing peacemaking for many, many decades, both in Israel and Palestine and here in the United States. So you're going to hear the story from Dr. Landau soon, but as a young man, 1978, I believe, was the year. He grew up in America, in the United States, in New York, but went to Israel, partly to learn more about his Jewish roots, but also to try to be of some use in resolving the conflicts and lowering the tension that is there. And so he spent several decades in Israel, became a dual Israeli-American citizen, and helped to found a number of peace projects in Israel, projects that brought Israelis and Palestinians together in a way that's very, very difficult to do. Any of those of us who have been there know how hard that work is. The sides are very entrenched. They don't often interact with one another, and to bring them together for peace and for understanding is a very challenging task. So one of the institutions that Dr. Landau helped to found is called the Open House. It's in a town called Ramle, Israel. And the story of the founding of the Open House is a fascinating one. I think you'll hear a little bit about that tonight also, but there's a wonderful book that I recommend to everyone called The Lemon Tree that was written in 2006 by Sandy Tolan, who tells the story of the founding of the Open House. And we actually have a group here tonight who are part of a book club who has been reading the book this year, and it's been very meaningful to all of us who have been involved. So I definitely encourage reading that book to learn more about the history of the conflict and also what is possible for those who are committed to peace. So Dr. Landau is a well-educated man with degrees from Harvard and also a D.Min from the Hartford Seminary, and he's also spent many years as a professor and a writer, writing articles. But throughout all that time, he has continued to work for peace. And I think that his current organization is a good example of the work that he continues to do. And I love this tagline, if you don't mind my quoting you here. The goal, he says, of his consulting group is to create spiritual remedies for our social pathologies. And what is more needed than that today in this time of where we all seem to be wandering in a kind of spiritual wilderness? So you have your work cut out for you there, Yehezkel, and I applaud you for doing that work. And so looking back at the career of people like Yehezkel Landau just reminds me of the quote from the Sermon on the Mount, from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." It is a true sacrifice to work for peace. One is often reviled by both sides of the conflict, and to put yourself in the middle, to listen to the hurt on the other side of the conflict, it's not an easy thing to do. People are often ridiculed and sometimes persecuted for their work for peace. But what I've found is, in our media, we always hear about the violence. We hear about Hamas atrocities, for example. We hear about, the bombs that have fallen in Gaza. And we don't hear much about all those people who have really devoted their lives behind the scenes to bring people together and to find a different way of living with one another. So we should honor them, and for that reason, I'm honored to have Dr. Landau with us this evening. So thank you for being with us.
Shalom to you all. Good evening. Thank you so much for welcoming me here. And your hospitality is really, it warms my heart. And I hope to be back. Been here about 24 hours and it's already changed my life in meaningful ways. And Dr. Finger, Mary Finger, thank you very much. Jim Paharek for organizing this. Bishop Kulick for your presence and your willingness to offer your reflections after I speak. And having this gathering connected to the amazing memory and legacy of Eva Fleischner is just, to me it's providential. And meeting Sister Gemma Del Duca after years of being together, working together in the Holy Land. It's just so many things have come together, and I'm deeply grateful. I thank God for this blessing. So you heard that the Fleischner family fled Austria in 1938. My parents did as well. And Chris Fleischner and I recently obtained Austrian citizenship by virtue of being descendants of persecuted ancestors. The Austrian Parliament a few years ago passed a law making this possible. So in many ways, there are incredible, I would say miraculous connections that I celebrate. So my parents fled Vienna in 1938. They had me in Santiago de Chile in 1949. When my sister was born 3 years later, we moved to Forest Hills, Queens, and I grew up in first the city and then the state of New York. My academic study was in psychology, theology, and education. And in 1978, I decided to put my body where my prayers had already taken me. And I was the first person in my family of origin, actually the last person to actually go to Jerusalem and the only one who stayed for close to 25 years because I felt that this was home for me. And I was linking my personal journey with the collective national homecoming of the Jewish people from over 100 diaspora communities. So as Jim Paharek acknowledged, I went there, first of all, for personal Jewish reasons, motivations, and also because I could not tolerate watching the violent images and news accounts from the Holy Land day after day and just weeping and praying. I said, I have to do more than this. Isaiah says in a prophetic vision, for out of Zion will come, thank you. For God's instruction, Torah will come out of Zion, and the words of God, God's teachings from Jerusalem. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah u'davar Adonai miYerushalayim. And to see this Holy Land desecrated by injustice and violence and needless suffering, it's been breaking my heart my whole life. So, my work there, I spent a couple of years working for the Israel Interfaith Association, bringing different religious communities together for mutual understanding and appreciation. Then I worked for 10 years with the religious peace movement, Oz v'Shalom, which means strength and peace, from the last verse of Psalm 29. God will grant God's people strength and bless God's people with peace. And then, starting as a project of this peace movement. My former wife, Dalia Yehezkel Landau, and I, together with 2 Palestinian families, created this open house peace center. The first family was this Muslim family called Erchere, who had been forcibly expelled at gunpoint from the house where Dalia grew up in after her family immigrated at the end of 1948 to Israel from Bulgaria. She was less than a year old. And she grew up in this house and wondered, she knew there had been an Arab family living there, but she didn't know anything about them until they returned from the West Bank town of El Bira next to Ramallah to see their house, which was built by Mustafa Al-Khairi, Ahmed Al-Khairi. Mustafa Al-Khairi was the mayor of Ramle, but Ahmed, another family member, had built that house in 1936. And the lemon tree image derives from the fact that before he died, he came back and visited the home, his home. And my late father-in-law had given him a cluster of lemons from the lemon tree that he had planted in the backyard, and whenever he couldn't sleep at night, he would pace up and down holding these shriveled lemons as a connection to his memories. So I also recommend Sandy Tolan's book, which gives a detailed account of these 2 families who have shared one house, representing 2 peoples sharing a common homeland and not being able to find an equitable way of sharing it and deriving blessing from it together. I'm just curious. I know that there's this book group reading The Lemon Tree or just finished it. How many, can you raise your hand so I know who here has been in that group? That's great. And I hope to connect with you virtually next month sometime. We can talk about it. God willing. So for both personal and professional reasons, I returned to the U.S. in 2002, but I just should finish the open house story because I kept this loose end. After Dalia's father died, my late father-in-law, we met Bashir al-Khairi, who had come to visit in 1967. He was living on Palestine Street in El Bira in the West Bank, and we met at the home of an Anglican priest and his wife, Audi and Patricia Rantisi. And we talked about what to do with this house now that Dalia had inherited it. And we decided, these 2 families, to dedicate it, first of all, to Palestinian Israeli children from Christian and Muslim families who lived in Ramle and the neighboring small city of Lod, Lida, El-Lid in Arabic, which is mentioned in the New Testament, so that goes back 2,000 years. Ramle was actually founded by the Caliph Suleiman in 716 to be the capital of this part of the expanding Muslim empire. And so Open House was born, first of all, we created an Arabic-speaking affirmative action preschool, which didn't exist. There were no Arabic-speaking preschools in Ramle in 1991 when we opened the doors. So that was Bashir's wish that his family home serve the educational needs of Arab children. And we welcomed that wholeheartedly. And we also created a series of joint Palestinian and Jewish coexistence and peace-building programs, including a summer camp that has existed since 1991 through wars and intifadas until today. So you can go online, just Google Open House Ramle, and you can get all the details on what we've been trying to do. And for me, this is a micro-laboratory for transforming conflict. And as Jim was saying, and I totally resonate with this truth-finding program, trust is based on truth-telling. And for 3 generations or more, you've had 2 propaganda machines spilling out self-referencing partial truth and ignoring the other one, and so both societies don't validate the narrative of the other. And the other is like the dark side of the moon, which nobody gets to see, and children are raised not knowing about it. in both societies. Well, in 2002, I was offered this faculty position at Hartford Seminary, which now calls itself Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, and I became the first full-time Jewish professor there, along with 10 Christians and 5 Muslims, 4 Sunnis and 1 Shia Muslim. And so the focus of my teaching and research shifted from Christian-Jewish relations to Jewish-Christian-Muslim relations. And the subject of Israel and Palestine is often the third rail in interfaith conversations, especially trilateral ones, but even bilateral interfaith relations between Christians and Muslims and Jews and Muslims. And my focus tonight, Jews and Christians. When interactions move from 2 dialogue partners to 3, the dynamics change. For example, you often see different issues creating alliances of 2 religious subgroups against a third. You have to be aware of that, and that may shift when the topic shifts. If you're facilitating such an interaction, you really have to be prepared for this. Sometimes the language that we use contributes to this unhealthy situation, when perceived favoritism creates suspicions. For example, if we use terms like Judeo-Christian values or Judeo-Christian civilization, our Muslim sisters and brothers are likely to feel excluded. They're part of our common civilization, including Western civilization, and they may fear a 2-against-1 alliance at their expense. And one of my fears about the present war is that the Muslim world, or large parts of it, could see an American-Israeli alliance against not just Iran, but Muslims in general, and that perception may harden and cause more challenges for us going forward. Although I believe that a new political framework encompassing the entire Middle East, including Iran, is needed to resolve the interrelated conflicts in the region, and I can just say now parenthetically, I'm on the advisory board here in America for an Israeli-Palestinian organization called A Land for All, which speaks about confederation between a majority Jewish state called Israel and a Palestinian state next door, basically the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And I would add the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to create a 3-state federation, similar to the Benelux nations in Europe, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. But here it would be Israel-Palestinian Urdun, in Arabic, Isfalur. And this is not my invention. People have been working on that vision already, at least for 2 generations. And I still hope and pray that that will come about, but we're a long way from that right now. So that's the end of my parenthetical forward-looking vision, and you can ask me questions about it. So my primary focus tonight is the relationship between Christians and Jews and how what's going on there has ripple effects for good and for harm here. I see this century-long conflict over the Holy Land as the primary unresolved conflict in the Middle East and the key to shifting the pervasive war mentality to one of peaceful cooperation and mutual blessing. If at any point in the past, Israelis and Palestinians had been able, under more courageous, far-sighted leaders, to reconcile their competing political and territorial claims, the hostility toward Israel harbored by Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, and their sympathizers around the globe would have been reduced to more manageable and far less toxic proportions. It may sound strange, but the radical transformation in Christian-Jewish relations since the Second World War is, for me, a source of hope that other long-standing conflicts, including this one, can be transformed from mutual antagonism to mutual appreciation and blessing. I sometimes use the term antagonistic interdependence. if you grow up only knowing the other as an enemy, what happens when peace breaks out? Who are you if you don't have somebody to self-identify against? So the watershed moment in the paradigm shift in Christian-Jewish relations was October 28, 1965, when the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions, usually referred to by the first words of its Latin text, Nostre Aetate, meaning in our time, was proclaimed by Pope Paul VI. And this document, particularly its fourth section dealing with the Church's relationship with the Jewish people, ushered in a radically new era in our relationship. In this document, the Roman Catholic Church renounced its centuries-long anti-Jewish teaching of contempt. That's a term from Jules Isaac, grounded in the false claim that it was the Jews, not the ancient Romans, who were responsible for Jesus' crucifixion. The document recognized the legitimacy of Judaism and Islam and condemned all forms of anti-Semitism. Following this historic declaration, different Protestant churches issued their own statements against anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism is a theological term, and anti-Semitism is more psychological and sociological, but they interrelate. Since 1965, the Vatican has issued additional statements clarifying and applying its new understanding of how Jews and Catholics are partners in advancing the plan of God in this world, and we should celebrate and be thankful for the remarkable achievements in Christian-Jewish relations during our lifetime, and this Holocaust Education Center is one example. And we need to strengthen those ties and build on them going forward. This long-term commitment is all the more necessary given the serious tensions that have emerged in the interfaith arena in the past 2.5 years. Following the Hamas-led massacre of about 1,200 people and abduction of some 250 people, Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, and foreign workers on October 7, 2023, and the ensuing Israeli military campaign against Hamas that has brought massive death, destruction, and displacement to the 2 million inhabitants of the Gaza Strip. Relations between Christians and Jews, as well as Muslims and Jews, suffered tremendous strains throughout the past 29 months, and some interfaith organizations ruptured under the weight of polarizing feelings and attitudes. Last year, a landmark book appeared. It was published by iPub Cloud International. It's called Stress Test, the Israel-Hamas War and Christian-Jewish Relations. I highly recommend it. The volume was co-edited by 2 highly regarded scholars of the Holocaust and Christian-Jewish relations, Sister Carol Rittner, a Roman Catholic, and John K. Roth, a Protestant. It is a timely collection of essays by Christian scholar practitioners with years of experience in Christian-Jewish engagement. It invites readers to address issues that for years were often avoided in order not to undermine the cordial relations forged between our 2 faith communities. James Baharek, who organized this evening's event, contributed an essay to this volume entitled The Israel-Hamas War, Challenges and Opportunities for Interreligious Dialogue. And I want to cite a couple of excerpts from Jim's essay. Quote, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim organizations in the United States that are committed to interreligious understanding, as we are at the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education at Seton Hill University, have always had to carefully navigate differences of opinion related to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Often we Christians, he says, have set such issues aside for fear that discussing them would interfere with the important work of furthering interreligious understanding in our own communities, where many of us have made valuable progress over the years. But the events surrounding the Israel-Hamas war have rendered it all but impossible to avoid the topic, which now seems to be the elephant in the room that must be confronted. And Professor Paharik adds, attitudes have hardened into absolutist positions that are sharply either pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, with little nuance or shades of gray. Exacerbating tensions further, acts of discrimination and hate directed at Jews, Muslims, and Palestinians have become increasingly common in the United States and abroad. These acts have brought the war to our American and Christian doorsteps, making it more difficult to view events in Israel and Gaza dispassionately. End of quote. Thank you, Jim, and the other contributors to this volume, very courageous witnesses. Now, talking about hate directed toward Jews for a moment, driving here from the airport, I saw the signs for the Squirrel Hill neighborhood, and I was immediately taken back to October of 2018 and the horrible massacre of the Tree of Life Synagogue there, which took the lives of 11 Jews in the middle of Sabbath worship by some hard-to-comprehend murderer with an AR-15 assault rifle, and he ended the lives and destroyed the worlds of 11 precious human souls, and their names are Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil and David Rosenthal, Daniel Stein, Bernice and Sylvan Simon, Irving Younger, Melvin Wax, and 97-year-old Rose Allinger. Zichronam livracha, may their memories be forever a blessing. At the trial of this hate-filled murderer who had the irrational notion that somehow Jews were bringing in immigrants and therefore white Christian hegemony in this country was going to end, Rose Mallinger's daughter Andrea said to the judge at his trial, "You cannot imagine the terror I experienced that day. I saw my arm blown open and my life blown apart as her mother died right next to her." This was the deadliest attack against Jews in U.S. history. So on a holy day, in a holy sanctuary, it was desecrated by death and horror. The Tree of Life, which is a reference to the Torah, is a tree of life, and in that synagogue, for that moment, death overwhelmed us all and was met by an amazing interfaith community response, which brought comfort to the survivors and the families of those who perished and the rest of us. So my own hope is that we can find ways to rise above the polarizing passions that turn us into partisan cheerleaders for one side or the other in the Holy Land, and adopt a stance of dual solidarity based on compassion for both Israelis and Palestinians who are suffering needlessly and yearning for a way out of their agonizing no-win war. For the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a morality play pitting villainous oppressors against innocent victims. It is instead a profound tragedy with global implications, with victims and victimizers on both sides. Both peoples have developed victim and vindication or victim and victory scripts, and through those self-referencing and self-preferencing lenses, each deems the other side vicious aggressors or terrorists, and their own side righteous victims. And since the Jewish side has wielded far more power for decades, its own narrative of national homecoming and collective redemption has caused more harm and continues to do so. But we have to acknowledge that if the power dynamic were reversed, so would the ratio of suffering. I wish more Christians would follow the example of the Christians who contributed to stress tests, We Jews, especially we Israeli Jews, need non-Jewish friends and allies who can speak candidly, tell truth to us about their concerns regarding Israeli actions and policies, especially when human lives are at stake. We all have to ask ourselves difficult and painful questions about how the Israeli government and military conducted the recent war against Hamas, and reach some clear moral decisions about what ends and means are permitted in armed conflicts. It's clear to anyone with a sense of what is humane and just that Hamas, the Islamist movement in Gaza, has over 2 decades committed war crimes by targeting civilians indiscriminately in its ongoing war against Israel. Suicide bombings on buses and in restaurants, along with missiles launched against civilian population centers, are manifestly cruel and morally repugnant means of waging war. The indiscriminate mass slaughter and kidnappings committed by Hamas militants and their allies in Palestinian Islamic Jihad on October 7th raised their level of criminality and brutality to unprecedented heights. What we have to acknowledge as well, if we value all human lives as equally sacred, we're created in the divine image, is that the Israeli response to the October 7th atrocities and to the extended hostage crisis was also characterized by war crimes. As a leading authority in the field of religious ethics, my longtime Catholic friend in Chicago, Father John Polakowski, writes in the chapter he contributed to Stress Test, quote, "Both Israel and Hamas have engaged in war crimes. In the Israeli-Hamas war, both sides have clearly violated internationally agreed upon rules of warfare. Without question," he says, "both sides have violated the proportionality principle in just war theory. Christian-Jewish relations cannot be honest if they fail to confront those facts." End of quote from Father Polakowski. The exorbitantly high civilian casualties and the scope of devastation in Gaza were compounded by the vengeful, dehumanizing, and even demonizing statements about Gazans in general by some Israeli officials, calling Hamas militants Amalekites, referring to the biblical tribe that mercilessly attacked the Israelites in the Sinai desert, or comparing them to Nazis, guarantees that their humanity, with its inherent sanctity, will be negated, making them and their innocent relatives or neighbors targets for high-tech Israeli weaponry. We have to ask, painful as it is, whether Israel's devastating military campaign had any realistic chance of defeating Hamas and its ideology, or whether the massive trauma inflicted on 2 million Gazans in retaliation for the trauma of October 7th and the excruciating hostage crisis will instead end up engendering deep hatred and yearnings for revenge among a new generation of Palestinian orphans. What makes the moral discernment we all have to engage in even more disturbing, but no less necessary, is the broader context for this latest war between Israel and the Islamists in Gaza. Globally, social media and partisan news outlets like Al Jazeera, most Israeli TV networks, and cable news networks here in the US have fueled polarization and a precipitous rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. That makes our interfaith conversations even more emotionally fraught, but also more necessary. Out of a heightened sense of insecurity, many Jews have turned inward and self-protective since October 7th, with trust overwhelmed by fear and compassion overwhelmed by enormous grief. The use of the term genocide by those who assail Israel's political and military leaders adds to both Jewish defensiveness and moral confusion about the war and its devastating consequences. Genocide is a term of vilification, presuming evil intent behind the slaughter of an entire religious, ethnic, or national group. I firmly believe that the intended targets of most Israeli military actions in Gaza were Hamas members and their infrastructure. Since Hamas is embedded in a civilian population, such attacks will inevitably result in a high number of civilian or non-combatant casualties. In my assessment of news reports, too many of those attacks ended up massacring entire families and decimating neighborhoods. Such disproportionate violence is a war crime, as is the withholding of food and medicine as a political policy. I want Israeli Jews to face up to these crimes, but that accountability is made more unlikely by calling the war, which Israel did not start, a genocide. It's important to appreciate that Jews throughout history have been accused of all manner of heinous crimes, including the cosmic sin of crucifying Christ, along with later calumnies, including murdering Christian children for their blood, desecrating the consecrated host, which is another assault on Christ's body, and spreading deadly diseases. This irrational Jew hatred over centuries, sanctioned by church authorities, led Jews to see such outrageous Christian slanders as demonizing projections, and that's how I see them. As a result, Christians who want Israeli Jews, or Jews in general, to acknowledge the real crimes committed by Israeli politicians and army officers and Air Force pilots, in the name of security, they need to be very careful not to arouse the conditioned reflexes of denial and counter-accusations. This is, my friends, this is emotionally fraught territory. And the best way to get someone else to listen respectfully to legitimate criticism is to start with honest acknowledgement of and sincere remorse for one's own community's past sins toward the people you are trying to hold accountable. So then, what are constructive Christian responses to recent developments in Israel and Palestine? First, we must recognize that we can't resolve this conflict from thousands of miles away. An eventual peace agreement will need to be negotiated by the warring parties themselves with the help of trustworthy mediators. Sadly, this will require a change in leadership in both Israel and Palestine. So it won't come soon. But I'll add there has to be an Israeli national election no later than October of this year. Right now, Mr. Netanyahu has the support of something like 17% of the population, so he would not be able to form a coalition if elections were held now. I hope and pray that over time, Palestinians and Israelis will have the opportunity to undergo a truth and reconciliation process similar to the one that South Africans experienced under the leadership of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And we need religious leaders to help with that, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In the meantime, American Christians should invest time and resources in strengthening the relationships established with their Jewish and Muslim partners here. This is a time to demonstrate empathy and concern for both communities as they cope with deep pain and grief. Going beyond that compassionate embrace, Christians who have developed relationships of trust with their Jewish neighbors and colleagues can do them a spiritual service by helping them see and understand the agony, the fear, and the despair of Palestinians, especially in Gaza. The ongoing violence against West Bank Palestinians by radical Jewish settlers, enabled by the passive stance of the Israeli army and police, is yet another cause for alarm and principled protest by people of all faiths. I encourage the Christians here to invite your Jewish friends with appropriate sensitivity and patience to expand their own broken, fearful, and angry hearts to take in the pain of others, especially Palestinians. Whenever we encounter people immersed in profound grief, as pastoral partners and friends, we can try to help them work through their deep anguish before the grief hardens into vengeful grievance, preventing them from constructively engaging others outside their trusted circle. here comes a deep lament. Sadly, most Christians who engage the issue of Israel and Palestine end up taking sides, either as pro-Israel Christian Zionists or pro-Palestine liberationists. The former are mostly evangelical Protestants who see the state of Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecies and also a precursor to the second coming of Christ. The latter group, the pro-Palestine liberationists, includes many anti-Zionists who view the Jewish homecoming and state-building project as an example of settler colonialism or a conquest by outsiders rather than the return of an exiled indigenous people for whom the connection with Eretz Israel, the Holy Land of Israel, and with Jerusalem is integral to our covenantal relationship with God. My own faith understanding, based on Scripture, views that land as God's laboratory for practicing justice and compassion, not just by individuals, but also by communities within a wider social fabric. In Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, a chapter before the so-called 10 Commandments, we call them the 10 Statements or the 10 Utterances, are revealed at Sinai. God says, Kili kol haaretz, all of the land is mine, belongs to me, and you shall be in it a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. As hard as it is to appreciate today, the militarized struggles of both peoples for national independence as a means for survival and security have obscured the deeper truth that they are politically, economically, culturally, and spiritually interdependent. When Christians choose sides in this century-long conflict between two traumatized peoples over their shared homeland, and the country, I'll remind you, is the size of New Jersey. The bifurcation of the global Christian witness only reinforces polarized positions and loyalties. Since most of the people living in the Holy Land are either Jewish or Muslim, Christians make up 3% of the whole population, a Christian stance of dual solidarity can inspire both Jews and Muslims to consider a non-binary alternative, imagining a win-win outcome rather than the debilitating lose-lose dynamic we have witnessed and lamented for decades. And for me, as someone who considers Jesus of Nazareth as one of my rabbinic teachers, to me he's Rabbi Jesus, and I view such a loving embrace of both Jews and Palestinians as a sign of Christian discipleship faithful to the beatitude in Matthew 5, which Jim cited, that peacemakers are the children of the one God. So I'd now like to address the particular pain and the spiritual crisis of Palestinian Christians. During my years in Jerusalem, I had the privilege of knowing and working with representatives of the different churches in the Holy Land: Roman Catholic, Greek Catholic or Melkite, Greek Orthodox, Lutheran, Anglican, Armenian, Mennonite, and others. I retain warm friendships with many of them, and I share their present pain as well as their belief in the transformative power of God's love made manifest through our actions and our relationships. I know many Christians in America who struggle to embrace their fellow Christians in Palestine, along with their Jewish friends here and in Israel. I salute them for their principled stance of dual solidarity based on inclusive justice and compassion. Palestinian Christians have a crucial role to play in this conflict that's far greater than their small numbers would suggest, especially as their co-religionists in the West exercise considerable political influence. How can Christians in America, Europe, and other countries outside the Middle East help their Palestinian counterparts transform their situations so they are truly liberated? Too often, those Western Christian allies adopt a perspective informed by Third World liberation theology, as developed by Latin American and South African writers such as Gustavo Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, Oscar Romero, Alan Bosek, and Desmond Tutu, along with Palestinian Christian theologians like Naim Atik, Mitri Racheb, and Munder Isaac. Although I share their critique of unjust political structures and power dynamics, including in the Israeli-Palestinian context, I find their liberation paradigm very problematic. For decades, church leaders in the Holy Land have condemned Israeli authorities for actions and policies deemed oppressive. They are also understandably appalled by the position of Christian Zionists, including the present U.S. ambassador there, Reverend Mike Huckabee, a Baptist minister. The Christian Zionist whose uncritically pro-Israel stance ignores the plight of Palestinians. Some of these church leaders' criticism in Palestine is valid and needs to be internalized by my fellow Israeli Jews. But most Jews in Israel and elsewhere become defensive and deny the accusations when confronted with one-sided moral pronouncements, indictments that lack any self-criticism or compassion for the suffering of Israelis. By viewing the conflict over God's Holy Land essentially as one between oppressive Jews and oppressed Palestinians, these church leaders in Jerusalem and the West Bank have forfeited, in my view, the opportunity to serve as bridge builders between the Jewish and Muslim communities. As I see it, their Palestinian loyalties supersede their vocations as disciples of the Prince of Peace. I say this with deep sadness, since I know some of these church leaders to be devout Christians with keen minds and loving hearts. I also know that if I were in their position, I would also think twice before publicly condemning Hamas and other Islamist militants, lest I be subjected to threats to myself or my family. The kind of liberation theology favored by progressive Christian theologians is rooted in the book of Exodus, which Jews and Christians consider sacred scripture. The Jewish festival of Passover begins next Wednesday night, and it's your birthday, Sister Gemma. Happy birthday. It's in the middle of Christian Holy Week. The Passover story is based, obviously, on the biblical account of God's victory over the tyrannical Pharaoh and the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. It's an uplifting story that has bolstered the spirits of many social change activists, including those in American abolitionist and civil rights movements. But I see two serious problems in using this dramatic account of liberation from oppression as the foundation of contemporary political theology. First, it involves widespread violence against the firstborn sons of Egypt in the 10th and last plague, and then Pharaoh's charioteers who drowned in the Sea of Reeds. Equally problematic is the tendency of oppressed peoples anywhere to become oppressors themselves when they assume power through a violent revolution. History has many examples of such tragic role reversals, from the French and Russian revolutions to the transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. Since I'm a believer, firm believer in non-violent means of opposing injustice and effecting social change, my own liberation theology isn't based on Exodus, but on the book of Genesis, which is a story over several generations of sibling rivalries, beginning with Cain and Abel, of fratricide, and then Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, and Joseph and his brothers. So in every generation, you have this competition for the paternal blessing with the father standing in for God. But it ends in chapter 48 with Jacob, renamed Israel, learning from this favoritism on his part, favoring Joseph, and his father and grandfather doing the same thing. And he, when Joseph brings Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, before him, he confounds Joseph by crossing his arms, and in the only place in Scripture giving them one inclusive blessing, that God should bless these two lads. And this is how Jewish fathers bless their sons at the Sabbath table every Friday night. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. if my son Raphael had had two X chromosomes, rather than my giving him the Y chromosome, and she had come out as Raphaela, then I would have blessed her together with her mother, that she be like the four matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. But the three patriarchs are not the role models for the paternal blessing in our tradition because they all made mistakes. Ephraim and Manasseh are now the new paradigm for inclusive shared blessing. And that's what Israelis and Palestinians need to experience. So the challenge for all of us in the Holy Land, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Muslims and Christians, is to develop a sacred story in which we are all liberated and blessed with freedom, dignity, and peace together. But such an inclusive narrative eludes both peoples and their leaders who are trapped in ongoing traumas that cripple the imagination and constrain the heart's capacity to love and be loved. In previous rounds of warfare, such as the 1982 Lebanon War or the two intifadas, the Palestinian civil uprisings that erupted in 1987 and the year 2000, the two peoples were led by secular nationalists like Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas for the Palestinians, and the late Yitzhak Rabin, Menachem Begin, and Ariel Sharon for the Israelis. I lived in Israel during all three rounds of fighting I just mentioned, and I was convinced that if the conflict between these two peoples claiming the same homeland were to continue for another generation, religious zealots would assume power in both societies and cause even more death and destruction, since religious absolutists consider political compromise to be sacrilegious against the will of God. My work with the Israeli religious peace movement Oz V'Shalom in the 1980s was aimed at forestalling such an outcome by offering a Torah-grounded alternative to the religious chauvinism of the Gush Emunim settlers, or even worse, the toxic racism of the late Meir Kahane and his militant disciples, one of whom, Itamar Ben-Gvir, now sits in the Israeli cabinet as Minister of National Security responsible for the police. I have to sadly acknowledge, and it breaks my heart that at least for now, my colleagues and I have lost our struggle for the soul of Israel and for a nonviolent pro-peace vision of Torah Judaism. And on the Palestinian side, the secular nationalists of the Fatah movement, led for decades by Yasser Arafat and now by Mahmoud Abbas, they've been superseded by the militant Islamists of Hamas. So my nightmare, I have lived long enough to see it come true. But I have not lost hope, otherwise I wouldn't be standing here. I'm not an optimist, nor a pessimist. I'm a faithful realist, and in that spirit I ask, what kinds of constructive actions can we undertake together to confront head-on the challenges we face as people of faith confronting this profound human tragedy? Let's start with speech. The parameters for discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have changed forever due to October 7th and the subsequent war. The threats to Israel posed by the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran and by its regional Shiite proxies in Lebanon and Yemen add another layer of political and moral complexity to our discussions. So we need a new kind of discourse to talk about Israel and Palestine and the wider Middle East. And the essays and stress tests are a commendable beginning. For example, we can't say anymore that anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel is inherently a form of anti-Semitism. We have to be more discriminating and acknowledge that there are different Zionisms, some of them inclusively just and compassionate, and some of them supremacist and sacrilegious. And we need to confront together the idolatrous fantasies of victory in air quotes, that unite militant, apocalyptic Christians and Jews. In addition, our conversations need to begin with confessional expressions of pain over what we have lost and also sincere remorse over the crimes committed in our name by those who claim or aspire to lead us. Truth-telling and reconciliation begin with each of us. Only then do they have a chance of becoming the foundation for healthier intergroup and international relations. For this transformative work of trust building, we have to include our Muslim sisters and brothers, lest they continue to view our mutual solidarity as a Jewish-Christian alliance directed against them. If we can engage in that more honest and fruitful kind of trilateral discourse, I would say, borrowing a term from the Passover Haggadah, dayenu, that paradigm shift in thought and speech would be sufficient. Beyond that, I can envision coalitions of Jews, Christians, and Muslims sharing the wisdom emerging from such deeper, more authentic conversations with the wider public through public statements, podcasts, and webinars, and when appropriate, joint appearances before political and religious leaders in Washington, D.C., Ottawa, Canada, Jerusalem, or at the UN in New York. Anywhere where our collective witness can make a difference, saving lives and minimizing suffering. So in closing, I want to recommend that you check out a discussion guide that my wife Joyce and I co-wrote, and you can download for free at her website. I'll give you the URL in a second. It's called How to Talk to Just About Anyone About Israel-Palestine, First Steps Toward Meaningful Dialogue. Okay? Joyce has an organization called My Brother from Another Mother, with echoes of Isaac and Ishmael. And you can go to mybrotherfromanothermother.org, and you can download this for free. So I believe in the trickle-up process of social change. Israel was built one kibbutz or moshav at a time, and peace at the macro level, I believe, is even now being midwifed into reality, into being by one peace laboratory at a time, Open House being just one of them. So I want to thank you for your attention. I wish those of you who will be observing either Holy Week or Passover in the coming days a meaningful time of reflection, family togetherness, and spiritual nourishment as we immerse ourselves once again in our respective sacred stories of past, present, and future redemption. Shalom, and God bless you all.
Well, Yehezkel, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about, and you've modeled the method of the peacemakers for us tonight. So we really appreciate your thoughts. And now we'll have a response from Bishop Kulick.
Thank you, Dr. Landry, for your thoughts and also your deeply personal presentation this evening, and for the witness of your life's work in interreligious dialogue and in peace building. Doctor's reflections this evening remind us that when we speak about the Holy Land, we are speaking not only about a place, but about peoples, histories, and deep human suffering. And therefore, we must always speak with humility, compassion, and of course, a sincere desire for peace. The Catholic Church approaches these questions from a very clear moral and spiritual foundation. The dignity of every human person, created in the image and in the likeness of God. Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim alike. The Church rejects anti-Semitism in all its forms, condemns terrorism and the targeting of civilians, and also teaches that even war has moral limits, including proportionality and the protection of human innocent life. Cardinal Piero Battista Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, has reminded the world that the mission of Christians in the Holy Land is not to take sides, but to remain, to abide, to be present, to pray, to serve, and to be the hands and feet and heart of Christ himself in the midst of such human suffering. He has said that Christians must be a people who build bridges, not walls, a people who speak the truth, but always, always with love. A people who refuse hatred, even when surrounded by it. And perhaps most powerfully, he has reminded us that peace is not first a political solution, but a spiritual conversion of the human heart. As Christians, we look to the Holy Land and we see not only a place of conflict, but the place where God entered human history, where God spoke to his people and called them to be his own, where Christ died and rose, where forgiveness was spoken from the very cross itself. That means for us, violence and hatred can never, ever be the final word. The final word belongs to God. And therefore, it must be reconciliation, peace, and truth. For our task, even here, thousands of miles away, it is clear that we must pray for peace, that we must be agents and examples of peace in our own communities, in our own homes, in our own respective places of worship. We must stand firm for the dignity of every human life. And we must support our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land, Jewish, Muslim, Christian alike. We must continue to witness as Christians to Christ himself in a place not only that was marked with such suffering, but in the land as we approach this Holy Week, in which Christ himself took on human suffering and died for us. Dr. Landau, thank you again for being with us tonight, with challenging us in some magnificent and thought-provoking ways, for reminding us that the work of peace begins not in the government, but in our human hearts, in our common lived experience, in our own respective faith traditions. Thank you for your presence with us. Thank you for being for us a sign and indeed a sacrament of what we are all striving for. Peace. The peace that we all know can only come from the heart, the mind, and the grace of God. Thank you.
Bishop Kulick, thank you very much for your reflections. And now we have some closing thoughts from Dr. Sarah Marsh, the co-director of our Eva Fleischner Truth Finding Project.
Thank you, Dr. Beherick, and thank you, Dr. Landau and Bishop Kulick, for these transformative remarks on our lives together. My job this evening is to connect these ideas to the work we are doing at Seton Hill. And so I would like you to cast your minds to a time when you were a student. Think back to a time you were sitting in class. And now I want to ask you a question. What were you there to do when you were sitting in class? I bet many of your answers included the word learn. To learn a particular job, to learn how to think about a subject that interests you, to learn what is next in your life. These are all very good answers. But Cornel West, the great American philosopher, says that the purpose of an education, the kind of education you're getting at Seton Hill, is to learn how to die. What can he possibly mean by this? There are, I think, at least two things. First, he means that we are finite creatures. We do not go on forever in this place, so we have to figure out what to do with the fact that we must live meaningfully in the knowledge that one day we will die. Second, Cornel West means that we must learn how to die to ourselves so that we can live in service to others. In large part, this entails dying to our old ways of being, to loosen the grip of ego and fear and corrosive social messages about what our lives are for. Of course, learning how to die is a rather morbid way of framing an education, so I want to emphasize that learning how to die is also a way of learning how to live. This evening, Professor Landau and Bishop Kulick have invited us into exactly this kind of learning. Dr. Landau has invited us to consider the Genesis story as a model of redemption and the inclusive and mutual blessing it requires. Bishop Kulick has reminded us that peace is an inward conversion of the human heart, and that the final word cannot be violence and hatred, because the final word comes from a loving God. Professor Landau has also asked us to consider what the Exodus story teaches us. The Exodus story has a cost. The firstborn sons of Egypt, the drowned charioteers, and the longer, more painful pattern in which those who were liberated by violence become in time the new oppressors. The cycle of vengeance, it turns out, does not liberate anyone. It simply rotates who is on top. It reorganizes the deck chairs on the Titanic as the ship rapidly takes on water. This insight is not just theoretical, nor is it merely historical. We are living through an era of profound political polarization, what Professor Landau called antagonistic interdependence. These cycles of grievance, retaliation, and dehumanization are not just happening someplace far away. They are alive in our own public life, and now they are deeply entangled with what is happening in the Middle East. The the work of repairing our fractured polity, of rebuilding public trust, will require human beings who have done the deep interior work of education, of learning how to die, to the need to win, the need to be right, and the need to have the last word. This is what your Catholic Setonian education is trying to build. Not just knowledge, but a certain kind of person who can be a conduit for peace in a world that most desperately needs it. Thank you.
Dr. Marsh, thank you for those thoughts. And by the way, I'd like to acknowledge Adam Pellman, who's here with us tonight, the director of our library and the co-chair of the Truth Finding Committee. We have all worked together to infuse the principles of truth finding into the Seton Hill curriculum. And it's been an enjoyable and a challenging process, but I think we're making progress, and we want to continue with that. Now, we really want you to ask us some questions. Our three panelists are here. You can ask any of them a question, or ask one a question and the others will jump in. One of my friends said to me earlier, you know, I'm not going to ask a question. This group is too big. I feel embarrassed to do that. Don't feel embarrassed, please. We've got a microphone there. Please come up and ask a question. We certainly have time for a few questions and some more dialogue. This has been a provocative and deeply exciting presentation this evening, so I'm sure you have some questions and some topics you'd like to pursue further. So please, come up and ask a question. Let's see, we're going to have to do an eeny, meeny, miny, moe. Okay, here comes our first question. Thank you, Amanda, thank you.
Thank you all so much for this wonderful lecture and responses. Dr. Landau, one of the things that you mentioned that gives you hope is that gives you hope was the response after World War II between Christian and Jewish relations. And one of the things that you mentioned tonight was that's maybe a challenge to that now is a lack of a shared understanding of the conflict, or a shared understanding of what should happen next. And so I guess my question is, how do we kind of as a culture and as communities of faith get to where we were after World War II to get to that point here? Does that make sense?
I hope so.
Okay.
Well, the Holocaust challenged the Christian world as no other event probably ever did. The present challenge is of a different order, and what I fear is that the progress made slowly and faithfully by Jewish and Christian faith leaders and ordinary synagogue and church attendees, it's under tremendous strain because of what's happening now in the Middle East, and now we're in an even greater, the pathology, the toxicity has reached proportions now with the present conflict with Israel and America allied with each other against the Islamic Republic of Iran, its regime, not the people of Iran. And I fear that there won't be any constructive or healing outcomes. More than that, and this is what we all face. It's not just Jews and Christians, okay? This is my diagnosis of the spiritual pathology at the macro level, and we're all suffering from this. The symptoms are profound and they're very contagious. I think we have in Washington, D.C., a grotesque distortion of Christianity wielding undue influence. And I'm thinking particularly the Crusader Christian who heads the Department of War, as he calls it, and makes with a Crusader tattoo on his body and makes, to me, abominable statements that are not in line with the gospel. We have grotesque distortions of Judaism in the Israeli cabinet. I mentioned one minister in particular, wielding undue influence there in the Israeli government. And in Tehran, we have, and I've studied Shiite Islam, and in fact, Shiites and Jews have much in common. But the Iranian regime, which just massacred tens of thousands of its own people, is a toxic distortion of what the Quran and the Hadith oral tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and his companions and disciples taught. So what do we do? I don't think any of these governments represents the majority of their populations in any of these three societies. But how do we transform this dynamic of unholy, violent, atrocious political and military actions into something that is pro-life and pro-peace? So, you know, I don't have any easy answers, but we have to mobilize in the streets and in our houses of worship and join forces, because no community on its own can change this whole toxic situation. So this is a very different kind of conflict. World War II was a clear war of good and evil, and Jews and Roma people and other communities paid a heavy price at the hand of the Nazi regime and its accomplices throughout Europe. But this is very different. So we have to find new language, new strategies of confronting the forces of darkness which are threatening us, okay? We have forms of religious fascism on the rise. And what do we do to counteract that? It's not enough just to, we can try as hard as we can to quarantine ourselves from this toxicity, but that's not, to me, that's what the Sabbath is. One day a week I get to kind of unplug myself from all of this craziness, in Yiddish, mishugas, you know, one day to recharge my spiritual batteries so the next 6 days I can go back to work and try to make the world a better place as God intends. So, can I turn the question back on you? Maybe you have maybe you have some insights, some therapeutic remedies. Anybody? I would invite anybody in this room to suggest countermeasures to what we are being subjected to now, and sadly too often in the name of the divine. And so this, to me, it's not just folly, it is sacrilege.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your question.
Just as a quick follow-up question, we'll go like this. I'm backed up by a nice representation of Mennonites from Scottdale Mennonite Church in Scottdale, Pennsylvania. And with their presence backing me up, one of the questions I have is, given the fact that the Israeli people, the American people, and so many other people are represented by governments that don't really represent their values, and in particular in the current war that's going on that, you know, the American people don't support, and in so many ways, the way the war was waged in Gaza, Israeli population did not support wholeheartedly. How do we practice resistance, particularly when we're thinking about like the Roman Catholic Church that has a robust just war tradition, and the current war clearly does not meet any of the criteria of the just war tradition? How do we practice resistance to this kind of business? How do we avoid getting dragged into wars that don't represent our values, don't represent our objectives as a people, yet, as you say, there are these binary forces sort of pushing us into conflict, pushing us into war? And, you know, I just look to the tradition of my wife and the Anabaptists, this robust tradition where they constantly stand against these false allegiances, these false alternatives, and they've suffered because of it. But by doing that, they provide this consistent witness of an alternative way. And I'm just asking you to think about, each one of you on the panel to think about, what are the kinds of ways we can, as a people, resist this kind of injustice and being co-opted by the violence of this injustice, if that makes sense.
I'll go first. So I am not a scholar of the Middle East or any of the conflicts there, contemporary or historical. I study the Atlantic literary and legal traditions of slavery and anti-slavery. And on this question, I think the record of history has some hope for us. It is the case that before the American founding, and certainly after the founding in what became the American Confederacy, the slavocratic power, the government that was founded on the idea it was lawful for one human being to own another as property, had control of the religious establishment. Certainly in the American South, this is true. It's also true in large portions of what was then the British Caribbean. And I think in that example, you can see exactly this case of, I am being represented by a political establishment that does not have my concerns, my beliefs at its heart. And that catastrophe of government, one human being able to own another, was dismantled in large part by the conviction of ordinary people that, as the bishop reminded us, every human being is made in the image of God. You can see this kind of rhetoric stretching back to the very earliest abolitionist tradition in the 17th century, even earlier, if you look to the Iberian tradition. So what I would say is that even as politics and government and religion, in many cases, are being, brought in to justify the brutalization of our siblings, of our human siblings, that there is always the fundamental truth that we are all one another's equals. We are all made in God's image. And so to focus our attention, focus our hearts on that fundamental truth instead of becoming distracted. And it is easy to become distracted in our contemporary media landscape. by all of the ways that these justifications are spun out, if we can help ourselves remember that every human being has a fundamental dignity, and but for the grace of God, I would be that other person, as James Baldwin reminds us in some of his later writings, right? Baldwin saw that, for any reason, right, I could be that other person. I could be the person who is suffering now. If we keep that idea at our hearts and we look to history, I do think the idea can carry us through, but we have to have it.
As Doctor said too, I think we have to go much deeper and more fundamental. I like to use the term more and more systemic. And to carry on what you were saying, Doctor, I think a lot of the crises and the challenges that we are facing on so many levels in our society and in our world today really boils down to an understanding of anthropology that has become, I believe, so distorted and so misunderstood from all of our traditions. When you look at the heart of how all of our traditions, our religious traditions, understand the human person and understand the relationship of the human person to God, that innate dignity and that desire by God that there be a respect from all human life. And as we have seen culturally, time after time, where there is a breakdown of a respect for that human life, we begin to see where not only are walls built up, but conflict begins in division. And I really appreciated today. Doctor graced me with one of his books, personally signed, and thank you, Doctor, for that. And of course, one of my great inspirations and one of my favorite saints is on the cover, St. John Paul II. And of course, we look at him in his much more elderly life with a cane, going in the Jubilee year to the Holy Land. And his entire life was a proclamation of the gospel of life. From that first moment of conception till natural death, that complete continuum of the human life and human experience. And if in any part of that continuum there is not that respect, it begins a cascading effect that is violence at its very heart. And we reap that so often. And I think, going back to Doctor, what you were saying, and Doctor, what you were also saying, is that we really see that with St. John Paul II, he understood the human relationship. And in that human relationship and in his own moment in human history, he was able to understand relationality at its deepest point. And I think that's where we're really challenged, and we could get into a lot of topics today. And one of the things I was thinking about, this whole lack of relationship, I think of our World War II generation, when they came back. There was that relationality with the community, with their faith communities, with volunteerism, because there was this human connectivity. They saw the face of suffering. They saw the face of war. They saw the face of discrimination. They saw the lack of peace. They saw violence. They saw the lack of people respecting basic human dignity. And their lives were lived in a spirit of gratitude and with a conviction that they wouldn't allow this to be repeated. And I think with the use of technology, and you even look at the war today with drones and all of these things, all this violence is becoming disconnected to the human experience and to the human relationship. And so I think it's a greater systemic issue, but I myself go back to anthropology. How do we understand the human person? And as people of faith, how do we see the human person in relationship to one another, to God, and to the world?
Thank you all for this wonderful event. Dr. Landau, in your talk, you emphasized the necessity and the virtue of truth-telling as part of this process. but you also returned a few times to the importance of avoiding provoking a kind of stubbornness or defensiveness that can sort of get in the way of a meaningful dialogue between different sides in this conflict. There's, I think, a clear tension there, right? Because truth-telling often requires the telling of hard and uncomfortable truths that naturally provoke defensive responses. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how one navigates that tension, particularly in relation to this very difficult conflict.
Thank you for that question. So let me try to be succinct. I think the reason most peace initiatives, peace movements fail is they only do the prophetic work of critiquing injustice and human rights violations. That's necessary but insufficient to really transform the dynamic because, as we see from the biblical prophets, their community did not really appreciate the message. The irony is the only successful prophet in Scripture was Jonah, who was sent to the Ninevites, the enemy, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, and they repented. All the other prophets were met with serious resistance to their appeals toward repentance and change of behavior. So, in my own work, I've tried to speak prophetically to my own community and also be a pastoral presence, encouragement for my fellow Jews who are hurting very deeply and fearing further pain inflicted upon them. So you need that pastoral, or I would say priestly, element added to the prophetic element. It is exceedingly difficult to speak prophetically to another community and expect them to take your critique seriously, especially because they have defense mechanisms. So we have to be aware of that, and that's why I said we have to start all of our conversations with self-criticism and demonstrating remorse for our own community's harm inflicted on the community we are now trying to address, because we're all walking wounded, you know? I see Jerusalem as kind of a paradigm of the human family writ large, where you have Jews, Armenians, and Palestinians in adjacent quarters, and they're all suffering survivor peoples. And God has brought them all together in a remarkable way, and the kind of parable that resonates for me is that if we could really see each other as Jacob saw his estranged brother Esau after 20 years of exile, and he came home, and after wrestling all night and having by morning a new identity and a permanent limp, he met Esau the next day and said, "I see your face as though I'm seeing the face of God." So if we could see the face of God, the image of God, even in our temporary enemy, we would be a long way toward healing these spiritual pathologies. Do you know, in the Maori language, the native people of New Zealand, the Maoris, they don't even have a word for enemy. The closest they have is somebody who was angry at me for a time. Think of what that means, a whole worldview without enemy making. So that gives, I sometimes wonder, are we programmed, are we psychologically kind of pre-programmed to need enemies to define ourselves against? I think all of our traditions, and perhaps Rabbi Jesus took it to the highest extreme with this profound commandment to love your enemies, but we're all, God through these messengers has taught us all, it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, it's not intended to be this way, but you have missed something, especially if you translate or interpret the text in ways that give you divine sanction to go and harm another community in the name of God. This to me is the most perverse distortion of true faithfulness. And yet we have, as we see, people who subscribe to what I think these are idolatries. So, okay, I want to just share with you that before this latest war started, I linked up with a mostly Christian group called Luke 10. 10th chapter of Luke includes the parable of the Good Samaritan. So this is a group that actually, their program committee is led by a Mennonite friend of mine for decades. His name is Doug Hostetter. And he invited me to join with this group, which includes American Christian leaders, former Episcopal Bishop of Washington, John Chain is one of them. Quaker leaders in Washington, D.C. are part of this group. And an Iranian former ambassador, Mehdi Farizadeh, is also a member of this board. And together we wrote a statement, which you can read online. It's called A Time for Peace, with echoes of Ecclesiastes. And it is calling on the Iranian and American governments to step back from the brink, which has now been crossed, and find sacred common ground that will promote life and justice and peace and not death and desecration. And it was signed initially by 15 American religious leaders, including 3 rabbis, whom I helped to enlist as signatories, and Christian and Muslim American leaders, and 6 Shiite clerics of significant stature in Iran, in Tehran and the holy city of Qom, Q-O-M, Qom. And it's now been signed by over 500 people, and you can add your signatures as well. Just go online to luke10.faith, luke10.faith, and you can find this statement and read it and add your names to it. So this is people-to-people diplomacy while our leaders go off into delusions of grandeur and false victory. So we as citizens, we can bear witness. This statement appeared on the official news site of the Iranian government, its news agency, both in Farsi, in Persian, and in English. And it was sent to the White House and to the State Department, but I'm afraid it didn't have that much resonance in either of those quarters. We can do something. People, we have power, you know? Remember people power in the Philippines, right? That brought, with Cardinal Sin's help, brought down Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. Remember that? Yes, we can do that.
Well, thank you so much. That's a wonderful way to close our discussion tonight. It gives us a lot of hope and inspiration. I would just say that if we look at the overall macro picture, it's easy to get discouraged and depressed, but it's important to remember what our speakers said tonight, that we can each make a difference. I know that the work that the peacemakers are doing in the Holy Land, it makes a difference. It doesn't stop Hamas or the bombs from falling on Gaza, but they change lives. There's a Benedictine community on Mount Zion that my wife and I work with, and they say, we're making peace one family at a time. So it's a slow process, but it's a meaningful process, and it has a positive impact. And I think we can all have that positive impact on our societies by following the principles of life rather than the culture of death, as John Paul II called it. So thank you to all of our speakers this evening. Thank you all for being here with us tonight.
Yes, I study 18th century literature, but it also led me, my interest in slavery and anti-slavery discourse led me also into the study of legal history.
You didn't preempt anything.
Well, you know, it's interesting from the Catholic American perspective.
No, it's fine. No, good. Thank you so much.